Pittsburgh's Point State Park sits at the juncture of three rivers. To the south, the mighty Monongahela rises from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. To the west lies the Ohio, an artery of the Midwest headed for the Mississippi. And to the north lies the Allegheny, the namesake of the county and the bearer of uncountable stories. Tracing the history of the Allegheny River brings us face to face with critical moments in the United States, from the relentless injustices of settler colonialism to the decline of the Rust Belt. From the birth of the fossil fuel economy to the seeds of state environmental protections, the river's meandering channel is a tour de force that shaped the country I call home. So join me on a journey down the Allegheny River as we explore its watershed moments. 500,000 years ago, the Allegheny River didn't exist, at least not as we know it today. Instead, the land formed three local watersheds whose channels flowed northward into the ancestral Erie Basin. These upper, middle, and lower Allegheny systems were the progenitors of today's watershed. Between 500 and 300,000 years ago, however, a wall of ice would remake the landscape. It's difficult to understate the transformative nature of the successive North American ice sheets upon the region's geography. From the walls of the Hudson Fjord to the largest freshwater lake system on Earth, each wave of glaciers iteratively molded the features that have defined the North America we see today. Via their expansion and flood-making retreat across the northwest of the basin, the glaciers of the pre-Illinoian period forced the lower Allegheny and middle Allegheny to reverse course and join each other. Likewise, the upper Allegheny would bend and join the middle Allegheny near what is today Salamanca, New York. From this initial state, the watershed of the Allegheny River took shape. Connecting to the continent's other river systems, the Allegheny now forms the northeasternmost drainage of the Mississippi Basin, for which it is now a sixth-order tributary. Glaciers of the successive Illinoisan and Wisconsin glacial periods continued to shape the watershed's geography. Northwestern glaciers deposited alluvial materials of sand, gravel, silt, and clay in the valleys and eroded the hills, leaving a terrain of more consistent altitude. The eastern parts of the basin that were glacier-free remained more mountainous, forming a steady gradient westward. Located entirely within the physiographic province of the Appalachian Plateau, the watershed drains nearly 30,000 square kilometers. The plateau is characterized by sedimentary strata that have been repeatedly broken by folding and faulting. This geology has produced fractured rock aquifers that carry and store much of the basin's groundwater. Atop this layer, the material deposited by glaciers in the northwest is generally much more permeable and forms a network of easily accessible valley-filled aquifers across the watershed. The 520-kilometer-long river begins flowing in what is now Potter County, Pennsylvania, where it flows north into what is now New York. After around 80 kilometers, the river turns back south to re-enter Pennsylvania. Today, this portion of the river's run forms the Allegheny Reservoir, the river's largest retention area. After 190 kilometers of meandering through rolling hills, the Allegheny joins its southern neighbor of the Monongahela to form the Ohio River in what is today Pittsburgh. With an annual average discharge of 20,000 cubic feet per second, the Allegheny is the largest of the Ohio River's tributaries. While the basic topology of the river has remained largely unchanged since the end of the last ice age, the landscape and ecologies of the wider watershed continue to evolve. Starting in around 8000 BCE, the climate began to warm substantially, arriving at modern temperatures approximately 4500 BCE. The retreat of the ice sheets and warming of the climate enabled the formation of a lush local ecology. The Allegheny Valley became home to beech maple, northern hardwoods, white pine, and hemlock forests. Over 250 species of birds, over 80 species of fish, along with dozens of reptiles, amphibians, and mammals formed a diverse community of fauna. Habitats in the mountainous eastern headwaters are lower in nutrients, but remain cold year-round. Moving westward, streams tend to become warmer, hosting a greater diversity of aquafauna. Among this burgeoning ecosystem lived another species that will feature quite prominently in the remainder of these stories: humans. The earliest evidence of human habitation in the region comes from the Meadowcroft site, with archaeologists dating the remains to between 16 and 19,000 years ago. It is possible humans inhabited the region prior, as lower parts of the watershed remained uncovered by previous glacial maxima, but Meadowcroft is the best marker we have. Moving forward, from 11,000 years ago to 4,800 years ago, archaeologists demarcate the Archaic period, In this era, the populations of the region steadily increased, operating in small bands of hunter-gatherers, likely each traveling over territories of 80 to 160 square kilometers. From the end of the Archaic era until roughly 3,000 years before present, the transitional period saw a warmer and drier climate, resulting in less plentiful food. In adaptation, communities tended to traverse less territory and add fishing and gardening to their legacy sustenance strategies. While communities became more sedentary, they also became more connected, with evidence of an extensive trade network in the mid-Atlantic region, likely forming in response to local food scarcities. Within the wider Great Lakes region, scholars characterize 3,000 years ago as the start of the early woodland era. In this period, we find evidence that those living in northeastern North America made regular use of robust ceramics to store and cook food. While they did not practice full-scale agriculture, it appears these communities largely harvested semi-domesticated vegetation including acorns and chenopodium, better known as goosefoot. Both were used to produce flour that likely supported a significant portion of local diets. Around 200 CE, we see a transition into a middle woodland period and the dominance of the Hopewell and Adena cultures of the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lake adjacent areas of western New York. The Hopewell were characterized by increasingly sedentary, stratified, and networked settlements. While their most iconic productions, elaborate earthenwork mounds, are not found in the Allegheny watershed itself, there is strong evidence of the existence of cultural interface across the entire basin. Following the decline of the Hopewell, by 1000 CE, we enter the later woodland period. This era is marked by an agricultural revolution sweeping across northern North America. Cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, commonly known as the Three Sisters, began to rapidly increase in intensity and became central to the nutrition of communities across the region. Within this period, we also observe a sharp increase in long-distance trade and evidence of intensified warfare between adjacent communities. Occurring over several centuries, these shifts corresponded to increased political and cultural consolidation. Many scholars hypothesize that this increased segmentation of the region's northern settlements contributed to the diversification of a previously common language system into distinct tongues. Many scholars hypothesize that this increased segmentation of the region's northern settlements contributed to the diversification of a previously common language system into the distinct tongues of Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, and Susquehanna. Zooming back in on the Allegheny River Valley, by the 17th century, the watershed was populated by the Algonquin-speaking Shawnee people and the new political entity known as the Haudenosaunee. These people of the Longhouse, later referred to by Europeans as the Iroquois, comprised a federation of 6 nations, with the Seneca-speaking communities most represented in the upper Allegheny Valley. Neither the Seneca nor their Haudenosaunee allies referred to the Allegheny as the Allegheny. They referred to it as the Ohio, meaning beautiful river, and applied the term to what we now call the Allegheny and Ohio rivers without distinction. Allegheny comes from the Lenape language of the Delaware people, a branch of the Algonquin language family. Just where in the Lenape lexicon, however, remains disputed. Some sources claim the Delaware referred to the people preceding their presence in the valley as the Talagawe, or Allegewi. Some accounts indicate that this may refer to a specific community, while others frame it more as a mythological term. Still others claim the term Allegheny originates from a Delaware translation of the Haudenosaunee's beautiful river, Welhakeni, most beautiful stream, with this then being anglicized as Allegheny. Peering back into English language sources, the earliest discussion I could find of the etymology was in the 1780 account of Moravian missionary David Zeisberger. Quote, "All this land and region, stretching as far as the creeks and the waters that flow into the Allegheny, the Delawares called Allegewinek, which means a land into which they came from distant parts. The river itself, however, is called Allegewisipo. The whites have made the Allegheny out of this, the 6 nations calling the river the Ohio." Now, this doesn't add much in the way of clarity, and there is plenty of baggage to unpack from Zeisberger's account, which we will, but it represents the messy nature not only of contemporary sources, but of contemporary actions, namely, the appropriation of land and language in the midst of radical destruction. For the Allegheny River Valley was not the traditional homeland of the Delaware. Historically centered around the mid-Atlantic coastline, they only began inhabiting the Allegheny in the 18th century, displaced westward by the disease-spreading, musket-wielding, name-transmuting founders of the would-be United States of America. When British expansion into North America began in the 17th century, Delaware peoples resided along the, get this, Delaware River. Much of the population was dispossessed, however, after the infamous 1737 walking purchase, where the colonists used runners instead of walkers to claim far more land than initially agreed upon. The land's former inhabitants migrated westward to settle in the upper watershed of the Allegheny, joining several other nations in a dynamic political landscape. By the 1740s, the area was home to the Shawnee and Delaware nations, along with those of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, most notably the Seneca, under the leader of Queen Aliquippa. Trappers and traders of French origin had established enterprises and political ties in the region over the previous decade. As trappers and traders from Britain expanded into the same area, they formed new arrangements with the local nations. The political landscape realigned against French interests. The French responded by building a series of forts. The British began building forts of their own. To reinforce the fort at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the British sent a small military force under the command of one George Washington. By the time he arrived, the partially constructed fort had been seized by the French. The 7 Years' War had begun. Embroiling near all of Europe's great powers, the causes of the conflagration were numerous. The initial spark, however, originated with the rivalry in the Allegheny Basin. Recognizing the significance of this conflict, the indigenous nations of the region began aligning themselves to advance and protect their own interests. The Allegheny was ground zero for the fighting. I won't concern this discussion with the details of the various military campaigns of the war, but I will highlight a few key takeaways. 1. After the war, the French no longer had a major presence in colonial North America. The Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and British were now the political authorities of the Allegheny River. 2. The landscape and communities were scarred by the intense violence. From the massacre of the Delaware at Kittanning to the smoking ruins of Fort Duquesne, the war proved highly destructive. As a result, the 1760s saw renewed expansion of English-speaking colonists and mounting resistance from the region's indigenous nations. The British Crown attempted to honor their agreements with the Haudenosaunee and limit settler expansion west of the Proclamation Line. This line was set along the eastern continental divide. If the water flowed west, it belonged to the Indians. This set the Proclamation Line directly along the boundary of the Allegheny Basin. Despite this action by the Crown, the tide of colonization did not break. Rallying anti-colonial action, an indigenous Great Awakening saw a series of charismatic religious figures and aligned political leaders organize a multinational movement against American encroachment. In April of 1763, nations from across the lower Great Lakes and wider Ohio Valley rose up. This movement was inspired by the prophetic figure Neolin of the Delaware and rallied forces from the Ottawa under Pontiac to the Seneca under Cayoxota. This action was not successful in stemming the tide. The colonial expansion only became more violent. Indeed, in June, the commanding officer at Fort Pitt intentionally provided, in one of the first documented cases, blankets infected with smallpox to Delaware visitors. While unclear if this actually worked, this example demonstrates a clear intent to destabilize and depopulate the communities of the upper Ohio River. This radical expansion was ultimately accommodated by British officials. In 1768, the Proclamation Line was redrawn even further west in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. Signed with the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, this treaty was but one in a long line of land cessions backed by hollow promises. While many of these treaties were quite deceptive, the First Nations of North America weren't hapless fools. In 1776, American officials tried to convince Delaware leaders to come enter into a protection agreement near Fort Pitt. These communities refused. Indigenous people were not passive obstacles. They were decision-makers operating within the geopolitical and social constraints of their time, constraints that sometimes made these treaties look like the best option, other times not. By 1778, the calculus had shifted. That September, Delaware leaders met with the commissioners of the newly self-declared United States of America at Fort Pitt. They negotiated and signed what became the country's first treaty with its Indian neighbors. To be clear, the Delaware still believed the United States intended to destroy them. Attempts to alleviate this concern by promising the Delaware the potential for statehood were not taken to be genuine. This was common understanding among inhabitants of the Allegheny Basin and well borne out by colonial actions. Remember that missionary David Zeisberger who tried to record the origins of the word Allegheny? According to his diary, his Moravian converts, quote, preferred to stay here in Indian country despite all the wars, because we can see in advance that some harm will be done if we go to the settlements of the white people. Ultimately, the settlements of the white people would come to them. The American War of Independence eroded the last vestiges of the proclamation line. Seeing the British victory as one of the few hopes to protect their future sovereignty, many communities of the wider Ohio Basin began aligning themselves with the British. In March of 1782, a Pennsylvanian militia began an expedition west. After capturing the town of Nottinghutton, the militia massacred 96 Moravian converts, including 32 women and 34 children. While the Nottinghutton massacre didn't occur in the Allegheny Basin, the contingencies precipitating it did. The Allegheny was the gateway to Ohio, and in turn, the rest of the continent. The political machinations and widespread violence that enabled the United States to wrest control of the region and repopulate it with white settlers would be duplicated across the West. Political and economic expansion was non-negotiable, regardless of the continent's human realities. In the word of historian Ben Kierman, United States policies towards Indians did not mandate genocide, but it was practiced when considered necessary. In 1784, perhaps the most significant treaty between the United States and the soon-to-be former inhabitants of the Allegheny Basin went into effect. The Second Treaty of Fort Stanwix formally ceded all territory north of the Allegheny and Ohio rivers. 10 years later, the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua saw the Haudenosaunee and United States arrange yet another displacement. The Seneca Nation, represented by Chief Corn Planter, would be relegated to the land just southeast of Lake Erie in the northern reaches of the Allegheny watershed. Now, despite the Americans' best efforts, Indians would remain and persist, but the political order was firmly that of New York and Pennsylvania, rather than Delaware or Haudenosaunee. In April of 1788, one Dr. Hildreth of Marietta, Ohio, passed through a town of just under 500 inhabitants outside the once strategically significant Fort Pitt. By 1810, the population was nearly 5,000. By 1910, over 500,000. In just a century, Pittsburgh had gone from a small outpost to the 8th largest city in the country. What lay behind this rapid growth? In 1789, the cost to send 40 tons of freight 350 miles over land from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was $1,500. The cost to send that same 40 tons 350 miles downriver from Pittsburgh to Louisville was $50. Sitting atop the continent's largest inland waterway and spectacular mineral wealth, the Allegheny River would serve as the vanguard of American industrial expansion. The rains from its smoky skies would usher in a century of radical transformation. In the fall of 1811, the first steamer operating in western waters left Pittsburgh. It departed for the same city to which it owed its name, New Orleans. The Allegheny River's position at the headwaters of North America's largest river basin made it the gateway to the west and the rapidly industrializing markets developing within the Mississippi watershed. Pittsburgh and its downstream peers of Cincinnati and Louisville grew as traffic down, and now, thanks to new steamboats up, the river expanded. The United States was colonizing the West, and that demanded a whole host of staple goods. Flour, pork, cider, and all manner of foodstuffs produced and processed upstream found a ready market farther down the river. It's difficult to capture the transformational nature of steam shipping on commerce in the Mississippi Basin. In 1814, the total tonnage of steamboats arriving in New Orleans was 2,098 tons. 7 years later, in 1821, it was 54,120. That's an increase of 2,600%. As the tributary with the greatest proximity to the industrialized core of the Mid-Atlantic, the Allegheny Valley and Pittsburgh in particular played a pivotal role in this transformation. According to the 1838 Louisville Directory, of the roughly 400 steamboats in service along the river, 112 were built in Pittsburgh. I'll get more into the local factors contributing to Pittsburgh's industrial ascendancy later, but the relevant part here is that the end of the Allegheny River marked the beginning of the American West. Zooming back into the Allegheny itself, its character was quite distinct from the larger Ohio and Mississippi. For most of the 1800s, the bottom 123 miles of the river between Franklin and Pittsburgh were navigable for small steamers only 6 months of the year when flows were high enough. Protruding rock formations, hairpin turns, unstable shoals, and narrow spans prevented the river from receiving heavier boat traffic. Instead, much of the freight transported along the Allegheny traveled via barges floating on the current and small flatboats pulled by horses from the riverbank. The latter method was commonly used to transport heavier loads, such as limestone, paving stones, and milling stones, from quarries along the Allegheny tributaries. According to the 1879 survey of the Allegheny River conducted by the War Department, however, the largest component of the river's traffic wasn't dug up, but cut down. Quote, "The chief commodity of commerce on the Allegheny River is, doubtless, lumber. Immense quantities of lumber came down every spring in rafts from its headwaters, augmented by others from the Clarion, Red Bank, Mahoning, and Kiskiminetas rivers. Harvesting mostly pine and hemlock, the forestry industry of the Allegheny watershed was vital for feeding construction downstream." Significantly, that same report also notes that the timber trade had actually peaked back in the 1840s and had been in decline ever since. Why were fewer trees being cut down? There just weren't as many of them left. In 1876, the State Board of the Centennial Managers reported that, quote, "The state, Pennsylvania, is heavily timbered and that many years must elapse before its forest will disappear." On the local level, it was a different story. The report prefaced that optimism with a stark declaration. Quote, "A large part of the Allegheny Valley has been almost denuded of its pine forests." The biosphere of the Allegheny watershed experienced intense stressors during the intensification and industrialization of human settlement in the valley. The most visible transformation was that of the forest, or lack thereof. Drought, fire, and severe storm conditions caused major damage in the 18th century, and exploitation in the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, depleted much of the remaining virgin and second-growth forests. Those living in the 19th century were by no means ignorant of the implications. According to engineer Thomas P. Roberts, in 1878, quote, "Clearing the forest lands, I believe, is followed by greater fluctuations in our river. I think the storm waters undoubtedly reach the streams more rapidly now than formerly, and thus may be affecting the increase in the width of the riverbeds observed so frequently in the West. With less vegetative ground cover and less precipitation infiltrating the soil, the watershed lost a principal mechanism for moderating runoff." Roberts' report also notes more severe erosion, with banks shifting and islands disappearing as more extreme events swept away sediment at increasing rates. Degradation of the forest and riparian habitats likely affected native animal life. In 1909, Dr. A. E. Ortman, curator of invertebrate zoology at the Carnegie Museum, published the report, "The Destruction of the Freshwater Fauna in Western Pennsylvania." Ortman saw documenting and preserving the species of the Allegheny watershed as his life's work. Referring to himself in the third person, he grimly reported that, quote, "In many cases his efforts were in vain, and life had entirely disappeared in many streams." Ortman then goes on to outline a typical succession of disappearance as the health of a stream declines. First to go are the mussels. Once they are gone for good. Second, freshwater fish begin to disappear, but they can reappear during high water periods. Next to go are the crawfish, then the gastropods. Fifth are the aquatic reptiles like snakes and turtles. Finally, Ortman identifies the muskrat as the most resilient organism to degradation of the river ecosystems, as they are not dependent on aquatic food. He cites three primary drivers of population decline. First, increasing hunting and fishing. As the population of the valley increased, nutritional pressure led to increasingly unsustainable practices. Second, dams constructed in the century prior were disrupting migration and reproduction for aquatic species. While most intense in the tributaries of the Monongahela, Ortman's observations extended to the headwaters of the Allegheny as well. These stressors alone, however, could only depress wildlife populations, not destroy them. In cases of complete ecological collapse, he puts the blame squarely on pollution. While it was commonplace for sewage to run off or be directly discharged into the river system throughout the century prior, Ortman claims a marginal ecological impact. The truly destructive contamination came from fossil fuel extraction. The coal, oil, and natural gas industries each contributed to the abysmal water quality through multiple pathways. Coal mines and coking plants leached highly acidic chemicals into streams, wreaking havoc on the biosphere. This mine water could easily be recognized by its distinct bluish-green color and accompanying rust-red deposits on the stream floor. From the various point sources across the Allegheny's headwaters, tributaries delivered pollutants into the lower basin. Quote, Kiskim-Nenetas River, at the point of union with the Allegheny, is in a fearful condition. Pollution consisting chiefly of mine water from the extensive coal regions of Westmoreland, Indiana, Cambria, and Somerset counties. Oil and natural gas production proved even more destructive. Not only did refineries discharge chemicals hostile to aquatic life and crude spill directly into waterways, but well sites regularly pumped salt water out of the ground. Salt infiltration degraded the surface and groundwater of well sites with knock-on effects on the wider watershed. Describing the effects of the oil city of Franklin on the biosphere of the Allegheny River, Ortman reported that, quote, "For 40 miles and more below there is not a mussel, not a crawfish, not a fish able to live in this water." Combined with the additional pollutants introduced from glass factories, chemical plants, and wood pulp mills, Ortman's final prognosis for the watersheds of western Pennsylvania was grim. Quote, "Unless we improve the quality of the water of our rivers, it is impossible to bring back the original condition of their fauna. And attempts to restore our natural resources with regard to the fish fauna by restocking our polluted streams with fish will be labor and money thrown away." Okay, I've buried the lead long enough. It's time to discuss the role of fossil fuels in the industrialization of the Allegheny Valley. 350 million years ago, the land of the Appalachian Plateau was home to a lush biosphere. Compressed and sequestered between sedimentary layers over millions of years, these remains became an extremely rich reserve of coal. Combined with oil and gas, these hydrocarbons defined much of the watershed's anthropogenic experience. The first coal mine of the Allegheny Valley, and indeed all of Pennsylvania, began operation in 1769 on Coal Hill in what is now downtown Pittsburgh. As the scale of use expanded in the coming decades, more mines were established in the lower watershed. Coal was transported via barge down the river to fuel the rapidly growing Pittsburgh. Ordinary barges carried from 600 to 1,000 tons with a draft of 6 to 9 feet. This coal was then floated or towed down the river and unloaded directly at manufacturing plants, also located on the river. That said, the vast majority of coal flowing into Pennsylvania wasn't mined in the Allegheny watershed. The Monongahela's rich West Virginia coal veins ultimately proved far more productive. By the mid-1800s, demand from the wider Mississippi basin led most of the region's coal to continue beyond Pittsburgh down the Ohio. In 1844, coal shipments from Pittsburgh totaled 2.5 million bushels. By 1866, it was 40 million. Readily accessible coal also fueled the competition to river-borne commerce, the railroad. By 1870, railroads had grown to cover the entire watershed, often following rivers on their paths. With their high speed and interconnectivity, railroads quickly became the primary carrier of passenger traffic, along with smaller finished goods, particularly between areas without direct river access. The growth of the rail network also added new obstructions to the river in the form of low bridges at points of already narrow spans. These bridges limited traffic based on the height of the boat and seasonal level of the water. That said, if you were on the water, and especially if you were shipping in bulk, not even the most efficient freight train could beat towing a barge down the Allegheny. For this reason, coal remained a prominent commodity on the Allegheny headed into Pittsburgh, and the dominant commodity headed out of it. This supremacy began to waver in the 1900s, when new coal mines in western Kentucky and Alabama provided a local source of fuel to the lower Mississippi, disrupting a key market for western Pennsylvania's coke. At the height of King Coal, the watershed also served as the backdrop to the dramatic rise and fall of another fuel, natural gas. In 1868, Atlantic Monthly columnist James Parton compared Pittsburgh's industrial landscape to, quote, "hell with the lid taken off." Choked with smog and soot, the city's ravenous appetite for coal, from steamboats to streetlights, made its air one of the worst polluted in the country. 2 decades later, however, the number of smoky days had declined sharply. Harper's Weekly observed that, quote, "a peaceful revolution had taken place in the city." The secret behind this transformation? An 1880s boom in natural gas. In the mid to late 1870s, oil prospectors found substantial gas supplies in Butler, Armstrong, and Clarion counties. While striking gas wasn't uncommon for oil drillers, instead of burning off a flare, a pair of local iron manufacturers opted to use the gas to heat their furnaces. A network of pipelines began spreading across western Pennsylvania as households, industrialists, and city officials all found gas preferable to coal. Pittsburgh streetlights, lit with coal gas starting in 1837, transitioned to natural gas once the 1880s rolled around and pipelines entered the city proper. By 1888, a single gas provider, Westinghouse's Philadelphia Company, single-handedly supplied gas to 700 mills, factories, and other businesses, along with 25,000 homes in the city. Supply, however, could not meet demand. With easily accessible gas depleting and subjecting customers to substantial market fluctuation by 1890, many industrial users, including the influential Carnegie Steel Works, retooled their plants to run on coal. Smoky skies were a figment of the past no more. Even as coal returned to primacy, the effects of the gas boom were clearly marked on the watershed. In the 1890 case, Nanny R. Collins versus Chartier Valley Gas Company, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court affirmed damages to the gas company for saltwater contamination of a private drinking water well. The opinion noted that, quote, "When the salt water is allowed to mingle with the fresh, it will spoil the whole neighborhood." In a future example, from 1906, the Department of Health investigated the claim from the Clarion Water Company that natural gas and oil wells in the watershed had polluted local drinking water. The Department of Health agreed, declaring the water supplies, quote, "prejudicial to the public health." To address well source pollution and saltwater infiltration, state and federal legislatures repeatedly attempted to regulate drilling practices. Laws passed in 1885, 1891, and 1921 mandated that unused and unfinished wells be capped off, though these laws remained poorly enforced until the 1940s. Perhaps the most significant mineral resource of the region was not a gas, but from a dark brown sludge. Now the largest crude oil producer in the world, the United States oil industry began with its first commercial well in 1859 near Titusville, Pennsylvania. Situated in the upper reaches of the Allegheny watershed, the stream later known as Oil Creek became the center of the nation's first petroleum boom. The region's geology positions the watershed with both plentiful and accessible crude oil. Located between layers of limestone and Marcellus shale, the folded landscape kept the remnants of the Devonian era near the surface and easily able to seep upwards. While indigenous communities had been harvesting from these seeps long before American industrialists rolled in, as kerosene began supplanting whale oil as the lighting fuel of choice and industrial lubrication needs expanded, extraction increased exponentially. By 1861, the Oil Creek corridor was producing as many as 20,000 barrels of oil per day. Without well-developed railroad or pipeline networks, barrels were floated down the river on barges towards refineries downstream. Private capital and working folk alike took notice. In just 6 years, the population of Titusville had grown from 250 to over 10,000. Similar transformations in communities of Pit Hole, Cherry Run, Pleasantville, and countless others industrialized the upper Allegheny watershed as never before. Indeed, the conspicuously named Oil City and Petroleum Center were planted by the same companies that sunk the wells that supplied them. By 1863, the rapid production increase had tanked domestic oil prices and led to a notable slowdown. Very few of these original operations proved profitable. Long-term prospects for the industry, however, remained strong. In the winter of 1867, the Allegheny Valley Railroad linked Oil City directly with Pittsburgh. Bolstered by strong foreign prices and more experienced operators, the industry solidified itself and continued to spread across western Pennsylvania, though the cycle of boom and bust would continue over the coming decades. This reckless expansion brought with it notable environmental impacts. In addition to many of the same well issues as gas extraction, oil brings another hazard: spills. In May of 1864, several boats laden with petroleum got jammed under a bridge at Oil City. The crash spilled over 25,000 barrels into the Allegheny River. Just by scraping oil off the water's surface, dippers could, quite profitably, harvest 50 to 100 barrels a day in the week to follow. This was so common, there was an entire secondary industry harvesting oil slicks from the river. While, like gas, subsequent decades saw oil extraction grow less overtly destructive to the immediate environment, the cumulative impact was immense. Production expanded to Hickory Island, Sugar Creek, Reno, Sandy Creek, Tionesta, Tidiote, and Emlenton. Most of the drilling happened on land that had once been used for agriculture. Records of the day refer to the farms that produced the oil and the families, later companies, that owned them. Within 2 decades, one company would come to consolidate nearly all of them, Standard Oil. As wells sunk into the ground, Pennsylvania production grew to a peak of 30 million barrels of oil per year, over half the entire U.S. production. While the state would rapidly decline from its peak, it succeeded in kickstarting potentially the most influential domestic industry in U.S. history. Which now brings me to steel. This video is already way too long, but I know folks are going to complain that in this entire discussion of industrial expansion along the Allegheny River, steel hasn't been mentioned yet. So yeah, steel is important, super important. Like, Pittsburgh's nickname is Steel City, its biggest sports team is the Steelers, and nearly everything in the city is named after Carnegie, Frick, or Mellon. The collapse of the steel industry in the mid-late 20th century destroyed tens of thousands of livelihoods and caused a significant contraction in many communities. In their wake, remaining runoff and slag from steel mills has proved incredibly harmful to human and environmental health. I chose instead to focus on hydrocarbons for 3 reasons. 1. They were more geographically contingent and distributed across the watershed. 2. They represent what I believe to be an even more transformative industrial shift. And 3. Everybody already talks about steel. I wanted to do something else. So that's all you're going to get from me. Let's try to start wrapping this up. Moving into the 20th century, major urban infrastructure projects continued to redefine humanity's relationship with the water system. Saltwater infiltration wasn't the only water quality concern in the 1900s. High rates of typhoid in Pittsburgh prompted the city to introduce sand filtration system in 1907 and water chlorination in 1912. Chemical contamination, however, would remain a mounting concern. Beginning in the 1920s, iron and steel mills began dumping slag at 9 Mile Run, a stream system now occupying the eastern portion of Frick Park. By the time they stopped dumping there 50 years later, the accumulation covered 96 hectares, with the largest mound reaching 36 meters high. The slag leaches toxic metals and treatment compounds into the water and soil to this day, swept away with each new inundation. And inundations remained a significant issue. Major flood events swept through the Allegheny Valley in 1883, 1907, 1936, and 1964. The 1936 St. Patrick's Day flood in particular peaked at 21 feet above baseline and caused the equivalent of $5 billion of damage in today's money. While by that point, the Allegheny already had 8 dams completed or under construction, these fixed crest dams and their single-chamber locks were designed to make the river more navigable, not control flooding. Constructed during the 1920s and 30s, they were only built to last 50 years, but are still in use today. The local government doesn't have the funds to maintain them, and the Army Corps of Engineers predicts it's only a matter of time before they begin to fail. Removing the dams is the cheapest and most likely option from here, but those plans have yet to take shape. In this penultimate chapter, I want to turn to the most significant dam along the Allegheny River, Kinzua. Kinzua Dam, located in the Allegheny National Forest, holds back the 27-mile-long, 120-foot-deep Allegheny Reservoir straddling the border between Pennsylvania and New York. Part of the flood control system authorized by Congress in 1936, plans for the dam didn't get moving until 1956, when the Army Corps of Engineers began surveying the site and surrounding area. That surrounding area was the territory of the Seneca Nation. I last mentioned the Seneca when discussing colonization with the Treaty of Canandaigua and Chief Coin Planter. But despite the US government's best efforts, they've been here the whole time. Remember those barges of lumber floating down the Allegheny River in the 1800s? An 1879 report on the Allegheny River by the United States Engineers Office also haphazardly notes that they were, quote, manned by half and quarter breed Indians, forming the remnant of Corn Planters' tribe, whose home is in New York. The Seneca, along with all the other indigenous communities living in the area, were marginalized at every turn of the American colonial project. From aggressive assimilation policies in public schools to exploitation in extractive industries, throughout this story, American Indians have faced a sustained systemic onslaught to erode their culture and undermine their sovereignty. By this point, the Seneca Nation had just over 4,000 enrolled members, of whom about 1,100 resided on the Allegheny Reservation, 1,800 on the Cattaraugus Reservation, and the remainder elsewhere. the plans for the Kinzua Dam were set to continue wiping the Seneca off the map. Once filled to capacity, the dam was projected to flood over 10,000 acres, or about a third of the Allegheny Reservation. 127 families residing in the proposed reservoir area, primarily in the communities of Jimerson and Steenburg. The federal government moved to acquire the land through eminent domain. The Seneca Nation, on the grounds that they were a sovereign nation, challenged the action in court in United States v. 21,250 acres of land, etc. The Seneca Nation grounded their legal defense in the Treaty of Canandaigua. The 1794 treaty affirmed a, quote, permanent friendship between the fledgling United States and the Haudenosaunee, and ceded the land in question, quote, forever, to the descendants of Chief Cornplanter. The federal judge found this unconvincing, as there was already more than sufficient precedent of the federal government taking lands from reservations via eminent domain. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers moved forward with the dam at Kinzua, with funds for its construction made available in the Public Works Appropriation Act of 1958. During the bill's formulation, Senator Irving Ives of New York made the observation, quote, by this action, we will be virtually wiping out the Allegheny Reservation of the Seneca Nation of the Iroquois Confederacy in New York State. I realize that under the procedure followed by the government of the United States over the years in handling of the matters concerning Indian reservations, the government has the legal right to do what is proposed. But what distresses me is the moral responsibility we have. Senator Ives voted for the bill. Construction moved forward. Regarding the, quote, responsibility spoken of by Senator Ives, the federal government responded in a historically consistent manner. In February of 1961, President Basil Williams of the Seneca Nation sent a letter to President John F. Kennedy of the United States asking for a re-evaluation of an alternative design and cease further construction. After a less than assuring response from the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Budget, in May, Williams wrote again, this time receiving a response from Kennedy 4 months later. Kennedy promised legislation to support the relocation of those displaced, which the U.S. government was already obliged to do, but promised nothing on the dam itself. That legislation took the form of H.R. 1794, passed in 1964. It allocated $2.4 million to the Seneca Nation and individual members, including compensation of houses and infrastructure, direct and indirect damages, along with $100,000 to cover expected increases in oil and gas drilling. It also created a fund of $12 million to, quote, improve the economic, social, and educational conditions of enrolled members of the Seneca Nation. This fund was to be jointly managed by the Seneca Nation and the Department of the Interior and forbid use of direct per capita payments. So, in exchange for their lands flooded, communities displaced, and rights as a sovereign nation violated, they got $15 million, $12 million of which was actually held by the U.S. Treasury and required approval from the Department of Interior prior to any use. The construction cost of Kinzua Dam was $108 million. The hydroelectricity generated from the dam was set to make back hundreds of millions during operation. Their land was taken for a pittance. And the U.S. government thought it was being generous. Senecas residing within the project had an average income of $3,894 per household during 1961. This compares with the average per capita income of $260 and $319 respectively for the Crow Creek and Lower Brule Sioux Indians, the most recent tribes to receive a legislative settlement for the lands taken in a flood control project on the Missouri River Basin. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think that citing that some people you marginalize have it even worse is a good reason to further marginalize the rest of them. In the end, over 600 people lost their homes, their property razed to make way for the dam. The plight was referenced in Johnny Cash's As Long as the Grass Shall Grow from his 1964 album Bitter Tears, Ballads of the American Indian. Every September, members of the Seneca Nation gather for the Remember and Removal Walk, a solemn procession from the Red House Bridge to the Steenburg Barricade. Within the last 10 years, the region has experienced a boom in natural gas production from the Marcellus Shale deposit that extends throughout the state. While easy-to-reach reserves were exhausted by the late 1890s, advances in hydraulic fracturing have opened up millions of cubic feet for extraction. This, quote, unconventional production injects water with a slurry of additives at high pressure into the shale to break it apart and release the gas found inside. Beyond rekindling fossil fuel production in the watershed, it has also provoked extensive environmental and human health concerns, from earthquakes to groundwater contamination. Have you seen videos of people lighting their tap water on fire? Some of those were shot in the Allegheny basin. On top of the water contamination, recent findings have also identified PFAS source pollution from several sites in the upper Allegheny watershed and significant concentrations downstream. The data on this is still infant, but it will certainly be a significant part of the watershed story moving forward. On a more positive note, in 2015, Seneca Generation acquired the rights to the Kanzua power generation and pumped hydro facility. After nearly half a century, the nation is starting to receive continuing benefits from the infrastructure their inundated land enabled. The energy extracted from the basin's fossil fuel ascendancy is likewise coming full circle. Due to climate change, precipitation patterns in the watershed are expected to fluctuate over the coming century. While significant, the relative shift is projected to be less severe than many other areas of North America, positioning the watershed as a bastion of temperate climate and reliable precipitation for the foreseeable future. Pittsburgh is one of the most cost-effective cities in the country. Invest now. That's a joke, not financial advice. But also, if I wanted to own a home this century, I'd know where to look. Indeed, the Allegheny finds itself at the vanguard of many of the country's great transformations. As the gateway to the West, the birthplace of the oil industry, and potentially a corridor of temperate stability in the new carbon-neutral society, its meanders carry with them the stories of triumph, despair, of dispossession, and discovery. I just hope my tribute to this tributary did it justice.